So Asperger's syndrome, it's difficult to boil down to a single thing because what it comes down to is that your brain is, for lack of a better term, wired differently than other people's. And Asperger's syndrome is a specific brain rewiring that has a bunch of different effects, and it manifests in a bunch of different ways. But I would say that the most important manifestation of Asperger's syndrome is the inability to learn social skills through osmosis. Most children, when they grow up, I mean, humans are social creatures. They run into other people, and those people try to socially interact with them, and they just sort of build up a library of social protocol, you know, what to do in certain situations through osmosis. They just absorb it gradually as they grow up. People with Asperger, whatever mechanism is responsible for absorbing social knowledge, it doesn't work as well. And so because of that, we often grow up not knowing how to interact with others socially, and because of that we often end up being seen as the weird kids, and that's not necessarily because we want to be weird, it's because we don't know how to act normal. I would say that even though there's a lot of stuff that goes into Asperger's syndrome, if you're meeting somebody with Asperger's syndrome and you're unfamiliar with it, your primary view would be this person is weird and I'm not exactly sure why, and it's because of the lack of social skills that they have. Asperger's is on the autism spectrum, so I mean it is related to autism, but it isn't autism. There are some things that make it different. For one, people with Asperger's syndrome tend to be more interested in social interaction than people with autism do, so they try to socially interact anyway in a way that autistic people often don't. But again, because it's all on the spectrum, like there are some lines and it's blurred, and sometimes it's difficult to peg down exactly what Asperger's syndrome is and what it isn't, and I'd recommend you talk to a psychologist instead of just somebody who has it, because I'm most used to my condition, not how the condition is generally. I believe that it's called Asperger's syndrome due to the researcher who first named it and I guess discovered it, in that they found that there was a category of people who are all exhibiting different symptoms. You're saying, how does it manifest with other people? I know that for some people, myself included, often Asperger's syndrome could also come along with sensory overload, that an inability to differentiate between important and unimportant signals in the world around you. So just like, I mean, the feeling of your clothes on your skin is something that a lot of people are able to tune out more often than, for instance, I would be. So I tend to wear more softer, more comfortable clothing in order to try and reduce the unnecessary stimulation. Things like that. People are more flexible when they have Asperger's syndrome. It's something that that's been proven. There's a correlation between flexibility and where you are on the autism spectrum. I don't even pretend to understand why that is, but I can't put my feet behind my head. I mean, like, there's a lot of things that goes into Asperger's syndrome that I think are kind of tangential to what most people with Asperger's syndrome would define as their main problem if they were asked, you know, how does it feel to be aspy? So I was originally diagnosed with ADD because I had a hard time paying attention in schools, and because of that I was working with counselors, and the counselors thought that there was something strange about the way that I was developing. People with Asperger's syndrome often tend to have stronger math and some science skills and things like that, and so just based on the way that I was acting in school, they thought that it would be a good thing to screen for, and they did, and they found out that I was definitely aspy. And for a lot of people, having Asperger's syndrome, like, I mean, that's a label, and we've been taught not to label people, but I have always felt as though being labeled as somebody with Asperger's syndrome is actually a tremendous advantage, because the moment that you figure out not this kid is weird, but this kid is weird because of this specific set of circumstances, it allows you to tap into a set of resources that has been specifically developed for people with your condition, so that you don't have to rediscover everything on your own. I think that having a label gives you great power in that it connects you with other people who are able to help you. And I mean, once my parents, like they said that when they read the descriptions of Asperger's syndrome, they just looked through it one line at a time and said, yeah, that's my son, that's my son, that's my son. And it was like reading a book about their child and about how specifically to help their child. And it was a great thing. After that, I started working with like a speech and language pathologist and some counselors and things like that. I remember like they had these books that showed facial expressions. It's like, here are 25 different ways that people can have an angry face, and so if you see any of these variants of angry, it means that you're probably doing something that might be offensive, you know, something like that. Whenever my father would see me doing something wrong socially, he would say, okay, Brennan, here's a script that you can use so that if this sort of thing happens again, this is how you navigate out of it. And as I was growing up through middle school, I basically just, my way of interacting socially was that I would have a very extensive library of scripts. You know, if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. If somebody inexplicably looks, you know, frustrated with you, apologize and ask them what you're doing wrong and try to develop a new script based on that. You know, just all of these different ways of interacting. And it wasn't until high school that I started being able to extrapolate from them general principles that helped me. I don't know if it's going to be something that can be generalized to the entirety of the Asperger population. I was diagnosed with ADD because I had a hard time paying attention in class, and that was because I was really, really bored in class. I mean, my father was teaching me long multiplication and division when I was in second grade, just due to the way that Aspies tend to be better at math and stuff like that. I was reading when I was 2 years old. I was like, I mean, all of these sorts of things. So when I just got into school, I was bored. They were saying things that I already knew. I had no interest in rehashing stuff that I considered to be beneath me, so I would act out instead. You know, I thought that it was kind of interesting. I would do something weird and unexpected just to see how people would react socially. And generally it was with anger, but sometimes not. And so they considered me to be ADD because I was off the walls and uncontrollable, but that was mostly due to boredom, not due to actual attention deficit disorder. Aspies have the ability to hyper-focus, especially in their subject area, almost to the exclusion of other things. And so because of that, like, we don't have ADD. It's the opposite. We tend to be hyper-fixated on one specific thing to the exclusion of everything else, and that's what causes more problems than anything else. I'm trying to think back of where I was at in middle school and what I wish I had known. Eye contact is way more important than you give it credit for. Eye contact is the way by which people signal interest in one another. So even though people's faces are generally pretty boring and you don't want to look them in the eye because there are more interesting things in rooms to look at, you should look them in the eye anyway, because it is basically a way of saying you are worth paying attention to. Likewise, if somebody is not making eye contact with you as you are trying to talk with them, it's a pretty strong indication that they do not want you to interact with them socially, and you should find some polite way to try and exit the conversation. You know, thank them for their time and leave and something like that. I would say it's very important to realize that people are invested in trying to maintain their image. If you ever do something that causes somebody to lose face, whether intentionally or not, then they will start acting in a more hostile manner towards you because they view you as a threat. So always be very aware of what people consider themselves to be good at and try not to challenge them in those areas. Always try to be aware of who might be watching the person that you're interacting with and try not to make them look bad in front of those people, which might also mean that you need to pay attention to who the people are watching are and what they consider to be important, especially with teachers. Teachers are a very bad person to accidentally embarrass. Make sure that there is turn-taking in conversation. When I was younger, I felt as though if I managed to retain control, like narrative control over the conversation, that it was less likely to go awry because the chances that somebody else would say something that would cause it to deviate off script would be lower. But if you don't give people a chance to respond in a conversation, then they become bored and no longer wish to interact with you. So make sure to give them time, and in all honesty, you will have a better conversation even if it goes slightly off script if you give them the opportunity to say things than if you just try to be the person who talks the entirety of the time. Just don't give up. You might feel like there are a lot of doors closed to you, but there are also a lot of doors open. Like, I haven't spoken too much about it because I don't like talking about it because I feel like it's bragging, but there are strengths that come along with Asperger's syndrome. You know, you have a mind that works more logically and in some ways less emotionally, and so that gives you a lot of power in certain fields and disciplines. Computing, mathematics. Because of that, there are people who will be incentivized to want you in their company or in their lives or something like that. And because of that, as long as you're able to act socially passable, then, I mean, people are willing to forgive a few faux pas, especially if they understand what's going on. Through practice, you can become more socially adept. It will come slowly and it will only come through hard work, but you can train yourself to be more socially skilled as long as you don't give up. Finally, like, I would say, do not allow the label to define you, allow the label to help you. I have a lot of friends with Asperger's syndrome that have missed out on a lot of opportunities because they have decided, this is the way that I am, I cannot change, and so people should adapt to me instead of me adapting to them. And when that happens, then you damn yourself, basically, because you keep yourself from growing. Once you've decided that you are acceptable as you are, and if anybody does not accept you, that the problem lies with them, you stop growing, you stop learning. It is always worth it to learn how to become more socially acceptable, because in the end, if you can do a decent imitation of normal, then that will give people enough chance to learn who you really are and to value you as a person. But if you can't learn to do a passable imitation of normal, then people will reject you before they get to know you. And if they don't get to know you, then they have no reason to see all of your strengths. This is going to be my high horse. So I'm married with a child. I'm married to somebody way better than I thought that I was ever going to be able to qualify for. And I think that when it comes to being in a courtship relationship, when a romantic relationship, when you have Asperger's syndrome, it's something that is difficult but not impossible. The thing that you need to know is that there are going to be many people who are going to give you scripts, social scripts about what girls want or how to date or things like that. And they're all junk. They're all junk. The thing is that every girl is different, and because of that, every girl has a different set of social rules that you need to learn that apply specifically to the girl in question. And if that happens, then you can end up becoming the perfect girl, the perfect boy for a girl without necessarily being the perfect boy for any girl. You don't need to be romantic. You don't need to be a pickup artist. You don't need to be suave. You just need to be the person who is right for the girl that you are interested in. In my particular case, I tried to learn the rules for courtship, and I learned them from the religious leaders of my church and my parents and other adults who I thought would be in a better position due to their experience to be able to tell me these things than my peer group would, because my peer group was just trying to figure it out by themselves as well. But the problem is that I learned an ancient and somewhat outdated method of courtship. You know, you bring them to movies and then out for ice cream afterwards. You bring them to plays, Mozart's Magic Flute, music impresses girls, that sort of thing. And when really what courtship is all about is getting to know a person. I had been warned against hanging out. You know, you want to go on dates. They should be paid for and planned out and paired off and that sort of thing. But that actually came across as very intimidating to girls. I would go out on dates with girls and they would say, why is he bringing me on so many fancy, expensive dates when we don't even know each other yet? In the end, what is most important is to figure out the social expectations of the girl that you are interested in and then adapt yourself to those social expectations. Be your own couple and reject the advice of the rest of the world, because in the end, if the only social rules that you learn are the ones that matter for the girl you're interested in, then that will all pay off for itself when you become the perfect person for that girl. Don't give up. Aspies can get married. I've gotten married. It's a thing that can happen. Make sure that you establish a relationship with trust as soon as possible, and because the sooner they know that the reason why you're off around the edges is because you're trying and not because you're just weird, the better off you'll be. Having a relationship of trust in which a girl can say, look, I find that sort of thing highly unattractive, just so you know, and you can say, oh, thank you for letting me know, I won't do that again. That's way better than just having the girl say, okay, thank you for your time, and then leaving and thinking that you're weird. The sooner that you can get into a style of relationship in which you have that open and honest feedback, the better you will be at iterating over your social routines so that you can be better at not offending or disgusting or frightening girls. I would guess strongly that Bill Gates has Asperger's syndrome, just based on the way that I've seen him interact. I don't necessarily have like a list of famous aspie people, but I mean people who are, for lack of a better term, geeks or nerds, the sort of people that, you know, don't talk as well or don't dress as well because, you know, that might look somewhat slovenly, but are really smart and do amazing things in the field of math or science. You know, those are people that I would personally relate to, whether they're aspie or not. The strengths, basically, I mean, our minds, for lack of a better term, run on an operating system. You know, everyone else in the world runs Windows, and we run Linux in our minds. And so a lot of the social programs that have been developed for Windows, we've got to port over and figure out how to make work on that. But our unique operating system also gives us strengths. You know, we can do certain things faster, more quickly, more reliably than others. And that it can give us power. Okay, here's a good example. I was in college. I think I was a sophomore in college, and I had a wireless battery-powered razor in my pocket because I had absent-mindedly stuck it there a few days previous and hadn't taken it out. So I'm sitting there at a table with my friends, and I realized I had forgotten to shave this morning, and I was just feeling embarrassed that I was unshaven, because that's the thing that you should, I mean, that is culturally acceptable in Provo, is to always be shaven. And I'm like, well, luckily I just have my shaver in my pocket. So I took it out and I started shaving. And then I just stop, and all of my friends are just looking at me. And I stop to it and I think, okay, whatever I'm doing must be socially inappropriate based on the facial expressions of like everywhere from mild embarrassment to shock that people are giving me. What could I be doing that's socially inappropriate? And I started thinking back, and I'm like, okay, I'm shaving, that's out of the normal. And then it just popped into my head. Shaving is something that you do in a bathroom, and things that you do in a bathroom are generally not socially appropriate in the Wilkinson Center. And so I apologized and I said, I'm sorry, I didn't even stop to think this might be strange. If you could excuse me for a moment. And I went and I shaved in the bathroom instead. But like, that was just something that didn't even dawn on me, that shaving at a table with my friends would be a problem. But then, like, in retrospect, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's just failure to generalize from things that are done in the bathroom should not be done in public. That's sort of the thing. And if you can imagine, especially for somebody who is young with Asperger's syndrome, take a faux pas like that and then multiply it by like 50 per day. And that's what it feels like to be aspie. You're just constantly doing things wrong all the time. You're offending people, you're making people angry, you're saying the wrong thing, and it's all just because you don't realize that there's a rule against it. You don't realize that, socially speaking, there's an entire library of different things that are just unspoken but you're supposed to know, and if you don't do them, you're weird and nobody will tell you why. And that I think is probably one of the best examples I could think of what it's like to be aspie. My experience with a speech and language pathologist has been that in addition to being able to help people with like affective disorders like stuttering or stuff like that, that they also are able to help people who say the wrong things at the wrong times. My speech and language pathologist was very good about being able to help run post-mortems on what I would do. If I went in and I'm like, I was just talking to this kid and then suddenly he got angry and left, she would say, okay, you know, let's replay the conversation. Tell me exactly what both people said. And we'd go through it, and then she'd say, okay, you know, right here is the problem. You know, you said this caused him to think about this, which caused him to become offended about this, which is why he left. when I was in elementary school, I thought that having a large head implied that you were smart, so I tried to compliment one of my friends by saying, "You look particularly big-headed today," and they got upset. And then my speech-language pathologist told me that that was because big-headed is an idiomatic expression that means like they're full of themselves or they're prideful. And so I'm like, oh, that's something I don't want to do. So the next time I saw that person, I'm like, I apologize. You're relatively small-headed. And then because I was trying to undo my earlier mistake, and he got even angrier. And so like I went back to the speech language pathologist and he said, no, being small-headed is an idiomatic expression meaning they're dumb. And so like I went back to the person, I'm like, okay, look, I'm really sorry. Actually, you have a completely normal-sized head and that's okay. And then he just thought that I was weird. And I mean, like a speech and language pathologist, if you do something like call somebody big-headed and then they get frustrated and you don't know why because you were trying to tell them that they were smart, a speech language pathologist is the kind of person that can help you debug what went wrong in something like that. A safe space for you to say, I don't understand why people are getting annoyed at me. What am I allowed to say? What am I not allowed to say? Don't talk about the sizes of people's head. It's just a lose-lose-lose situation. You can't win. Just don't say anything in that regard. The first thing to do is to build a relationship of unflinching honesty, especially for people with Asperger's syndrome. Just the entire social dynamic around what you're allowed to say when can be very confusing to navigate. And if you just have a policy that it's like, look, you can tell me anything at any time and I can tell you anything at any time, it just cuts through the fog and suddenly you have somebody that you can ally with, because instead of always having to be on your toes about like, oh, did I say the right thing at the right time, you've got somebody who is also willing to dispense with the social game and just say what they really mean instead of saying what is supposed to be said and confusing convoluted situation. Once you develop that relationship of trust, then what you can do is you can start telling your aspie loved one when they are doing something socially wrong in a way in which they can feel trusted that you love them anyway. A lot of people think if somebody is weird, the best thing to do is to not mention that they're weird, because mentioning it is going to make them feel worse about themselves. But that's entirely the wrong tack to take for somebody with Asperger's syndrome. If they're weird, it's not because it's just who they are, it's because they are trying to be normal and failing in some way. And the closer that you can, and the more quickly you can work with them to determine where that disconnect is and to help them be normal, the happier they will be, because they want to act normal. They know that it is only by acting normal that they will be able to have healthy, normal relationships with the majority of the world. So that's what I would say. Don't just ignore their weirdness, but bring it up to them. Say, hey, you might not realize this, but shaving is a bad thing to do at a table with your friends. That this is something that you should probably do in a bathroom, because otherwise you will get weird looks and people will think that you are strange. That's something we want to hear. We want to learn how to interact with others. Be patient with us. We're really trying, and we're trying the best that we can. And if you give us the benefit of the doubt and explain to us where we're going wrong, then we can fix ourselves, and we will try to learn how to be more appropriate and more socially appropriate. Don't reject us necessarily because we don't follow the same social protocols. I know that it can be very unnerving for people to have somebody who is not acting socially in the way that you would expect them to be. And some people would say, oh, it's dangerous. If he's going to break these social rules, what other rules are they going to break? And in all honesty, especially with an Asperger's syndrome, not many. We're moral people. We know that we aren't supposed to do anything dangerous. It might be uncomfortable to deal with us sometimes, but it doesn't mean that we are dangerous in any way. And we respond to feedback pretty well.